Imagine a Wall Street day trader executing like 58 trades before the closing bell. They're constantly monitoring the wire, rotating assets, dumping shares, pivoting into safe havens.
Yeah, standard high-frequency stuff.
Right. But now imagine that same day trader is also, well, a sitting world leader, someone who is actively deciding the geopolitical fate of the global oil supply and, making regulatory decisions that directly impact the very companies they are trading.
Welcome to the Impeach 47 podcast. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Marcus.
And our reporting shows that the reality of executive action right now isn't just a story about abstract policy decisions. It's fundamentally a story about executive power intersecting with massive, unprecedented financial movements.
Yeah, and in today's deep dive, we're really looking at three distinct pillars of this reporting.
Right.
First, we're unpacking a 113-page ethics filing that details a sitting president trading stocks at a volume and, a pace we have literally never seen in American history.
Second, the downstream economic reality of the current Iran war. Specifically, how it's creating a severe bottleneck that hits domestic gas prices. And third, the unilateral creation of a $1.776 billion Justice Department fund.
And, these might sound like three totally separate news cycles if you're just skimming the headlines, but they are deeply connected by a single thread.
Right, the structural mechanics of how the presidency operates today and how it utilizes financial architecture.
Yeah, and for you listening, this is why you need to care about those mechanics. These are not like academic debates happening in a vacuum. These are explicit examples of how executive actions are directly affecting your wallet.
Hitting you right at the pump.
Right, dictating the price you pay at the pump and redirecting your tax dollars entirely without congressional input.
So let's start with that first pillar, the financial disclosure. On May 14th, a mandatory Office of Government Ethics filing landed. Our team spent days going through it, and it is 113 pages long.
Just a massive document.
Yeah, and what it documents is a volume of individual stock trading that, frankly, completely redefines the boundaries of the office. We're looking at a total of 3,642 stock transactions in just the first quarter of 2026.
Wait, I really want to pause on the sheer math of that because the volume is staggering when you break it down. If you're looking at roughly 90 days in a quarter, taking out weekends and holidays.
Right, market days.
Yeah, how many trades per day is that account actually executing?
Well, if you look at the raw data, it is 2,345 purchases and 1,296 sales. For an account held in the sitting president's name, valued somewhere between $220 million and $750 million. That averages out to roughly 58 trades per market day.
Wow.
58 individual actions of buying and selling stock in companies whose regulatory futures the administration is actively managing.
That is what I find so just difficult to reconcile. Because this isn't someone tossing money into a passive retirement fund and forgetting about it.
No, not at all.
Right. 58 trades a day implies hyperactive, aggressive management. What specific sectors are they targeting?
The holdings are incredibly concentrated in sectors highly sensitive to government policy. We see positions in the $1 to $5 million range in major tech players.
Like who?
NVIDIA, Microsoft, Broadcom, Amazon, Apple. But you really have to look at the sector correlations to see the whole picture. The filing shows significant holdings in Coinbase, Robinhood, and SoFi.
Oh, wow.
And those purchases sit right in the middle of a highly active pro-crypto policy window pushed by the administration.
And on a traditional finance side, our reporting shows holdings in JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Visa held during a period where, the administration was aggressively stripping away financial regulations.
Right.
But the most alarming part of this ethics filing isn't just what the account held, it's when the account moved. Talk to us about January 12th.
Yeah, so January 12th is the critical data point for causality here.
Yeah.
That was the day the administration publicly announced a 25% tariff on countries buying Iranian oil. On that specific day, the presidential account completely sold off its position in the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. Out of 113 pages, that was the largest single sale executed.
And we also saw movement with hyperscaler stocks around that same time. Hold on, though, for those of us who, don't spend our lives reading tech finance reports, what actually is a hyperscaler?
Right, so a hyperscaler refers to the massive tech companies that provide cloud computing and internet infrastructure on a global scale. We're talking about Google, Amazon, Microsoft,
The big guys.
Yeah, the companies that essentially build the physical backbone of the internet and artificial intelligence.
Okay, so these hyperscaler stocks, our reporting shows the account dumped those shares only after the administration leaked a tariff carve-out that specifically exempted those companies' core chip businesses. The massive sales followed the exemption arrangement.
Which brings us to how the administration is attempting to defend this. Eric Trump spoke to reporters and claimed the family's assets sit in a blind trust managed by major institutions and invested in broad market indexes. He went on record calling the suggestion that individual stocks were being bought or sold a, quote, lie and blatantly false.
I am sorry, but you just cannot reconcile that public statement with the actual government filing. I mean, a blind trust holding broad market index funds does not produce 113 pages of individual stock transactions.
Not even close.
If you hold an S&P 500 index fund, that is literally one line item on your disclosure. It is not an itemized list of 58 trades a day.
Yeah, it fundamentally contradicts the math of the filing.
Right.
And historically, I mean, this is completely unprecedented. Since Lyndon B. Johnson established the presidential blind trust norm back in 1963, every modern president has navigated this to avoid obvious conflicts of interest.
Right.
Jimmy Carter literally sold his family peanut farm to avoid agricultural policy conflicts. Barack Obama held his assets in U.S. treasuries. Joe Biden used a managed blind trust. Even those who didn't divest completely utilized broad passive index funds.
But I need to push back on this historical reliance on norms because this is where the structural vulnerability of the American executive system is just glaring. Yeah.
I mean, what is the statistical probability that an account makes 58 trades a day, hitting the precise dates of tariff announcements and regulatory carve-outs purely by coincidence?
Zero.
Right. So if we rely entirely on 60 years of gentlemen's agreements rather than explicit statutory law, aren't we structurally defenseless when a commander-in-chief decides to actively trade in the markets they regulate?
That is the gaping hole in the ethics framework. There is no statutory law currently prohibiting a president from doing this. It shatters 6 decades of established norms, sure, but it doesn't violate a specific criminal statute.
Wow.
Yeah, the enforcement relies entirely on the executive branch policing itself. Senator Elizabeth Warren has called for an SEC investigation into potential insider trading, but the Securities and Exchange Commission operates under a chair appointed by this administration.
Let me guess.
Yeah, they have not opened an inquiry.
And this leads us directly to the real-world impact, because if we follow the money in that 113-page filing, it moves out of the theoretical and into a story about global stability.
On March 4, the day Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the presidential account suddenly executed a massive rotation into safe haven assets.
Right. The account purchased the iShares U.S. Treasury Bond ETF. And the very next day, March 5, the account bought into an energy ETF and the iShares Gold Trust.
Big buys, too.
Yeah, both in the $500,000 to $1 million band. So you have this private financial pivot into gold and energy happening precisely as the geopolitical crisis in the Middle East escalates.
Which transitions us from the president's private financial pivot directly into the public's financial reality. Because the economic fallout of this war is hitting Americans immediately in their wallets. Let's trace the timeline here.
Okay.
The strike started on February 28. Since then, the Strait of Hormuz has been blocked.
Right, and to understand the bottleneck, you really have to understand the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Roughly 20% of the world total oil consumption passes through that tiny strip of water.
And the logistical backlog is massive. Our reporting shows that right now, roughly 1,600 ships remain trapped or are being forced to undergo massive reroutes around the Horn of Africa.
That logistical nightmare triggered an unprecedented global supply shock. The International Energy Agency estimates supply losses from Gulf producers have already topped 1 billion barrels. We saw North Sea dated crude peak at $144 a barrel before settling near $110.
Let me stop you there for a second. We hear terms like Brent crude or WTI often, but why are we specifically tracking North Sea dated crude here, and why should the listener care about that benchmark?
Because North Sea dated crude is the most important physical oil benchmark in the world. It effectively sets the baseline price for the actual physical barrels of oil that global refiners are purchasing to turn into the gasoline you put in your car.
Got it.
So when that specific benchmark spikes to $144, it means the raw material cost for global transportation has violently increased.
And what does that violent increase mean for you, the consumer? Well, domestic gas prices have surged from $2.98 a gallon when the war started to $4.52 today.
It's incredible.
That is a 4-year high. Our reporting calculates this has cost U.S. consumers an estimated $20 billion in added fuel costs. And the supply chain risks go far beyond oil.
Let's talk about the agricultural impact, because 30% of global urea exports flow through that exact same strait.
Right. And urea is the primary nitrogen input for commercial agricultural fertilizer. When you trap 30% of the world's supply in a conflict zone, you create a severe downstream cascade.
Meaning?
Well, less urea means more expensive fertilizer. More expensive fertilizer means farmers plant less or they pass the cost on. The inflationary pressure starts at the gas pump, but it is heading straight for your grocery bill across any import-dependent market, which makes the administration's stated policy calculus regarding this economic pain so incredibly jarring. Let's look at the timeline. On May 12th, standing on the White House lawn before heading to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping, President Trump was asked directly by a reporter if the financial situations of everyday Americans were motivating him to strike a ceasefire with Iran.
And his response?
His response was that he doesn't think about Americans' financial situation, quote, not even a little bit. He stated his singular focus is preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon.
I mean, it is rare to hear a president so explicitly separate domestic economic pain from foreign policy objectives. And when Bret Baier played that clip back to him days later during a Fox News interview, the president did not walk it back.
He doubled down.
He doubled down. He called it a perfect statement. He made it unequivocally clear that domestic economic pain is entirely excluded from his foreign policy equation.
Meanwhile, the ceasefire negotiations are currently on what the president himself called massive life support. What is the actual holdup at the negotiating table?
The demands are just fundamentally incompatible right now. The administration is demanding a rigid 10-year halt to Iran's nuclear program and the complete surrender of 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium.
Wonderful.
On the other side of the table, Iranian negotiator Mohammad Ghalibaf is insisting on Tehran's rights to maintain their infrastructure. It is a total diplomatic stalemate.
It's a diplomatic stalemate, but the economic meter is running every single day for American consumers paying $4.52 at the pump. And here is a glaring policy contradiction I really need us to unpack.
Okay.
The administration goes to Beijing, negotiates a requirement for China to purchase $17 billion in U.S. agricultural products, and immediately touts that as a massive economic victory for the American worker.
Right.
How does the administration reconcile claiming a $17 billion trade deal as a massive win while simultaneously declaring that a $20 billion fuel burden on Americans is entirely irrelevant to its policy calculus?
What you're highlighting is a deep compartmentalization of foreign policy. When an economic outcome can be packaged as a direct, muscular negotiating triumph, like forcing an agricultural deal with China, it is heavily centralized in the administration's messaging.
Sure, it's a win.
Right. But when the economic outcome is a negative byproduct of military action, it's categorized as a separate universe, completely irrelevant to the mission at hand.
But our reporting shows that the administration is actually highly capable of focusing on financial well-being when it involves political allies. And the irony of that transition brings us to the third pillar of today's deep dive, which is the creation of the $1.776 billion Anti-Weaponization Fund.
Yeah, this specific maneuver is a masterclass in exploiting legal architecture to achieve a political outcome. And the origin of this massive fund starts with a deeply unusual lawsuit. President Trump filed a $10 billion civil suit against the IRS, alleging the government failed to prevent a contractor from leaking his confidential tax returns.
But the lawsuit immediately hit a very obvious logical wall in court, right? U.S. District Judge Kathleen M. Williams pointed out the core legal paradox. Basically, how can a sitting president sue an executive branch agency that he currently controls while his own Justice Department is simultaneously tasked with defending that agency?
Exactly. I mean, it created an unprecedented conflict of interest. Facing a strict deadline from the judge to explain how this constituted an actual controversy, rather than just the president suing himself, the president's personal lawyers suddenly dropped the suit.
And then what happened?
Well, in exchange for dropping it, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who we must know was the president's former personal criminal defense lawyer, announced the creation of this massive new fund.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of this, because I want to challenge the structural reality of what just happened. Congress holds the purse strings in the United States, right? They're supposed to appropriate funds. So This feels structurally like a CEO suing their own corporation, settling the lawsuit with themselves, and then using the corporate treasury to pay out their friends, all without the board of directors ever getting a vote. How does this fund completely bypass Congress?
That analogy is structurally sound. The $1.776 billion, and we should acknowledge the deliberate founding-era branding of that number, is drawn directly from something called the Treasury Department's Judgment Fund.
Okay, what is that?
The Judgment Fund is a perpetual indefinite appropriation. It was originally designed as an administrative tool so the government could quickly pay out routine court judgments and settlements. Like a mail truck hitting a civilian's car.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it lets them pay it without having to ask Congress to pass a new law every single time.
But the DOJ cited a specific precedent for using it this way, didn't they?
Yes, they cited the Obama-era Keep-Eagle case, which utilized the Judgment Fund to create a $760 million settlement pool for Native American farmers who claimed decades of government discrimination.
But structurally, what is the actual difference between Keep-Eagle and this new fund?
They are totally different. Keep-Eagle involved a massive class action lawsuit with the defined class of plaintiffs who had undergone years of rigorous litigation regarding documented civil rights violations.
Right.
This new fund was created as a settlement condition for a lawsuit brought solely by the president to pay out a vaguely defined class of individuals, and it is administered by a board that answers only to the president.
Let's talk about that board, because the administration of this money is incredibly centralized. There are 5 commissioners. All of them are appointed by the Attorney General, with only one chosen in consultation with congressional leadership.
Just one.
Yeah. And crucially, the president retains the power to fire any member at will. There is 0 independent oversight, and the fund closes on December 1st, 2028.
But the eligibility requirements are what generated the immediate shockwaves. The fund is open to anyone claiming they were wrongfully targeted by the Biden administration, and the Justice Department explicitly confirmed this eligibility extends to the roughly 1,600 people charged or convicted in connection with January 6th.
Wow.
Yeah, including individuals convicted of assaulting Capitol police officers.
We should also note a very specific detail of the settlement terms. The president and his family receive a formal government apology, but no direct cash from this specific fund. Still, the backlash on Capitol Hill to the fund's creation was immediate and bipartisan. Representative Jamie Raskin called it pure fraud and highway robbery. Representative Joe Neguse called it brazen corruption.
Right, and 93 House Democrats, joined by a number of Republicans, quickly filed a legal brief attempting to block it. They're calling it a political slush fund, arguing it violates both the constitutional separation of powers and the Domestic Emoluments Clause.
Stop right there and clarify the Domestic Emoluments Clause for us, because that is a vital constitutional guardrail that rarely gets discussed. What actually is it?
So the Domestic Emoluments Clause is a constitutional provision that strictly prohibits the president from receiving any compensation from the federal government or any state government other than their fixed official salary.
Right.
The argument being made by lawmakers is that by engineering a settlement where the president essentially directs nearly $2 billion taxpayer dollars to a fund designed to benefit his political allies, he is extracting an unconstitutional benefit from the government. The fact that the settlement gives his family an apology rather than direct cash may be a deliberate legal maneuver to avoid tripping that exact clause.
Which means we are watching the Justice Department legally weaponize civil settlements to completely bypass the constitutional requirement for congressional appropriations. And that leaves us with a much broader, incredibly urgent structural question to ponder. Because when you look at the entirety of what we've discussed today, from a sitting president executing 58 personal market trades a day perfectly timed around tariff policies, to an explicit stated indifference to a $20 billion inflation burden crushing American consumers, to nearly $2 billion in taxpayer dollars being dispersed to political allies while bypassing Congress entirely.
That's a lot.
It is, and all of it is completely decoupled from traditional oversight. So are we simply witnessing a temporary erosion of political norms, or are we watching the permanent legal rewriting of the boundaries of the presidency?
It's a massive question. It really forces every citizen to ask if a democratic system built almost entirely on gentlemen's agreements and institutional norms can survive an executive branch that is willing to test the absolute limits of statutory law.
If this reporting is useful, support us by wearing the movement. Go to impeach47.earth for hats, shirts, and stickers. Every item you wear is a walking billboard and the thing that keeps his research fed. You can read the full reports on Substack and follow us on X, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at the handle @impeach47.